So as folks continue to transition into the session, perhaps I'll get the ball rolling and ask some questions of our two speakers this morning. First of all, I want to thank both of you, Dr. Pelletier and Dr. Tenuta, for your excellent presentations. Provided a lot of great information there and a lot of food for thought around on your perspectives related to sustainable protein. Perhaps I can start with a question to Dr. Pelletier and to say, Nathan, you gave us an excellent overview of sort of life cycle assessment modeling and approaches that you've used in the egg sector and the generation of quality data. Do you see how what the potential is to transition this to outside of the egg sector and perhaps to other commodities as it relates to sustainable protein? How translatable is this to other sectors?
Certainly from a methodological perspective, it's entirely translatable. On the data side, with most of this kind of modeling, because the basic premise is to model along supply chains, we can understand synergies, trade-offs, interactions. When we look at agricultural systems in Canada, so much of what we need to model any given system is going to be common, right? Think about things like fertilizers, transportation, energy carriers. For any livestock sector, most of the feed inputs will be modeled in common. That was really one of the key rationales behind developing the Canadian Agri-Food Lifecycle Data Center, and now this initiative with NRC to scale up towards a national lifecycle inventory database, is that we all need this kind of data in common. With respect to the insights that come from this modeling, while most of the work that I've done in my lab over the past 6 years has really focused in on the egg industry, I'd say probably 90% of the insights that we've generated are directly transferable across all of the feather flocks. Probably 50% of the insights are transferable across monogastrics generally. So there is a really high degree of applicability across sectors and outside of the kind of egg industry specific applications that I described.
Oh, that's great, great. Speaking specifically around the sort of the laying flock, certainly I know that there's been tremendous interest in looking at alternative housing systems, and that brings sort of that welfare dimension into this question of sustainability, because certainly we can through the multi dimensions of sustainability, I think animal welfare is a component. I'm wondering if you've looked at sort of how alternative housing systems like aviary or even open or free range production systems, as opposed to even the furnished cage housing or even the conventional cages, how those is there much difference in terms of when you do your life cycle assessment on greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, I'll answer your question going a little bit more broadly than greenhouse gas emissions, since you mentioned welfare as well. And I mean, that's one of the quintessential questions facing the egg industry, right? Because it's undergoing a transition from conventional to alternative housing systems. And so farmers want to know, well, what housing systems make most sense and what will the trade-offs be? Really topically, one of my PhD students, Ian Turner, just yesterday submitted a 2-part manuscript that reports first methodologies for and second a case study application applied to the egg industry of his efforts to integrate animal welfare metrics into traditional life cycle assessment, so we really can understand potential synergies and trade-offs from an efficiency perspective and across various aspects of animal welfare when we look at different housing systems. Now, we have published work comparing the life cycle environmental impacts of eggs produced in different housing systems in the country. And there are certainly some differences, right? We tend to see the highest efficiency performance, albeit not by a very large margin, but in conventional cage systems. And I mean, that's intuitive because there's been so much research and development funneled into optimizing production in conventional cage systems. And there's a lot of there's a big learning curve for producers who are transitioning to alternative housing systems. But that said, the differences are not really that large. Where we tend to see the sweet spot is in what's called enriched colony cages. So we kind of get the best efficiency and animal welfare outcomes in those kind of systems. But there's no black and white answer with respect to, from an animal welfare perspective, what system is better. We can look at welfare in terms of, the biological status of the animal. So things like, rates of mortality or incidence of disease, or we can look at effective state, or we can look at the degree to which the animal has access to natural behaviors, right? And so in conventional cage systems, we tend to see better outcomes with respect to welfare metrics in the biological status domain. But of course, we see better outcomes in the alternative housing systems, cage-free systems, if we look at the degree to which the animal can access natural behaviors. So it's with all of this kind of work, there are always those synergies and those trade-offs. And that's why it's so important for us to be able to prioritize, well, which of these things should we prioritize and why? And if we take that into account in a systematic manner, then what choices logically flow from that?
Great. Thanks for that. Mario, certainly talking about metrics and choices, your presentation provided us a lot of different tools that could be available to look at reducing, in particular, nitrous oxide and greenhouse gas emissions. Certainly you looked at the impact of going summer fallow, the impact of pulse inclusion on nitrous oxide and crop rotations. I'm wondering, how do you translate that to the producer benefit? Certainly, I think greenhouse gas emissions is reducing those is the goal, but how do we translate that goal into something that's measurable for the producers so that it's incentivized to move to some of these processes?
Question. So it's going to come down to economics, likely, as usual, as most things for farming in Canada will come down to. So the one thing that I see as very positive is that there's multiple potential benefits. For example, in terms of including pulses in soy in rotations that we discussed, and so it's going to come down to actually using several of those probably as incentives for farmers. And really the farmer's going to have to make the decision themselves, of course, right? If they're going to adopt more pulses in soy, for example, in their rotation. So it will come down to factors such as fertilizer cost, which has skyrocketed recently. It was always recently the highest input costs. Now it's even higher for a field crop producer. So that's a big factor. I'm seeing farmers make decisions about their cropping based on nitrogen costs and availability. Another is the commodity value itself. For example, the value of field peas, of soy, and other competition crops such as wheat, canola, are going to factor in as well in terms of what is the return potential for the farmer. Now, those are what I would refer to as traditional factors that farmers base decisions on, right? We're going to have some new factors coming in here now. One of them is going to be in terms of policy and potentially incentives to reduce N2O emissions. We're not quite sure how those exactly will look like. At the moment, things are very voluntary, and they may change. And so we just don't know. So let's take an example. In Europe, there are guidelines, directives for EU in terms of nitrogen use to limit, in this case, their case, nitrate leaching. That has had a big impact on how nitrogen is used and managed in the EU. Another factor that is forthcoming is greenhouse gas credits. And so we're the development, we're promised a national system for greenhouse gas credits and trading. And so the ability for farmers to be on that market is going to be very important. So in terms of for soil carbon, but also for N2O emissions. So when you start putting the mix of those together, it's not, I don't think it's one factor, but it's going to be a mix of those factors that farmers are then going to decide on what is the best for them in terms of cropping. Of course, as those factors change, then those decisions will change. But I see in terms of we have a great appetite for oil, edible oils, and so soybean, for example, provides that and protein source. We have high quality protein available from, for example, from peas. In terms of being able to process, and then you also have the direct consumption of pulses. And of course, Canada is looked at as a stable supplier in the world market for this. So I think it's very positive, and I think farmers are going to benefit from it.
Great. Thanks for that. Nathan, you introduced a decision-making tool, the NEST program that you're working with Egg Farmers of Canada on. Perhaps what has been the sort of uptake of that by farmers? I know it's early days, but could you comment on that? And is that the type of a tool that could be translatable to other commodities, such as, for example, pulse crops, and allowing farmers to make those types of decisions on how we can reach our goals around sustainability?
Sure. So down to the first part of your question, we launched the tool, or this first version of the tool, our Nest Lite version, in February. And Egg Farmers of Canada has been promoting it fairly heavily to farmers. So we have, I'm not sure what percentage of farmers have accessed the tool within the supply managed sector to date. I would guesstimate around 10% so far. With any new initiative, there's always going to be that subset who are, the leaders, the experimenters, and get out and try new things. We have noticed that we've had a higher degree of access than of actual completion of going through and entering data for a full completed flock. And we think it's because once the farmer's into the tool and realizes, oh, I need information pieces X, Y, and Z, they need to go off and get those pieces. And so they log out of the tool and may not come back. So we're going through a consultation process right now. One of my PhD students is undertaking a series of semi-structured interviews with farmers to really figure out what aspects of this tool are really working for you, which are not. What additional features would you like to see embedded when we roll out the full version of the tool beginning in the fall? The second part of your question around transferability, I would say what's in the background of this tool, again, is highly transferable, but the front end pieces. So right now, this first version of the tool specifically includes performance benchmarks for egg farms. So you could take this kind of architecture and you could replace that with performance benchmarks for any kind of farming, whether it was swine farming or pulse farming or otherwise. And it would work in a similar fashion. That piece of the work, though, that user interface, that was outsourced to a third party, to a software developer called Mirago that has those skills. I think that bit of the work is a little bit on the pricey side, but also if you want something that's really polished and easy to use, it's probably a good investment to make.
Okay, great. Maybe just a couple of questions that are coming in from our audience members. One for Nathan. How do you define a net zero energy barn? I think that was a question that we had from one of our members.
Sure. So a net zero energy barn, it would be defined similarly to any kind of net zero energy building. So typically net zero energy buildings are buildings that first have really highly efficient thermal envelopes. So to minimize heat loss or gain, depending on weather conditions. They have a variety of technology systems focused on maximizing energy efficiency within the building. And the third critical piece is that they integrate some kind of renewable energy generation technology that can produce at least enough renewable energy to offset any non-renewable energy that's consumed by the building system.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Here's a question, maybe I'll direct it to Mario. Would there be benefit to increasing the inclusion of locally grown grain legumes and feeds for Manitoba pigs and poultry? I'll start with Mario and then Nathan, if you wanted to comment also. So it's a question around the inclusion of locally grown grain legumes in feed.
Yeah, I see two approaches there. One would be for the farmer themselves to produce their own grain legume for feed and then mix their own ration. So I can see that having benefits from the standpoint of transportation that wouldn't be involved. You wouldn't cut out middle suppliers and so forth like that. So I can see quite a real advantage to that. The other is to consider locally grown, as I say, Manitoba grown or regionally grown grain legumes. And again, from there, I can see definitely a benefit in terms of energy use, in terms of transportation, because in that case, locally grown and mostly would be shipped by truck rather than rail. And so there would be, as the diesel goes up, we're going to be, cost savings, but then also be greenhouse gas savings as well. So there's definitely from that transportation resource utilization for sure would be a great impact
Okay. Nathan, did you want to comment on that question yourself?
Sure. I agree with most of what Mario said here. By benefit, it really depends on what you measure. So we've done quite a bit of work with Pulse Canada over the past few years, developing highly regionalized models of the life cycle environmental impacts of producing peas, lentils, and dry beans, mostly on the Canadian prairies, but also extending into Canada. And depending on the specific production context, we actually see some pretty substantial differences in the life cycle impacts of different crops. And that finding is certainly not novel. Often, depending on production efficiencies, it may actually be advantageous to import specific crops elsewhere if they're produced much more efficiently in different places. In fact, one of my PhD students did some modeling work for Pulse Canada, comparing the environmental impacts of pulses produced on the prairies and exported into Europe, compared to some of the pulses produced in Europe, Ukraine, and Russia. And for some of those supply chains, it was actually environmentally preferable to export Canadian pulses from the perspective of a European buyer. But that's according to metrics like, greenhouse gas emissions, energy intensity. But if we look at that other side of the equation, supporting local economies, maintaining good supply chain infrastructure at a regional level, then we might come up with very different answers as to what's preferable. So it always comes down to, well, what are we really managing a specific supply chain or specific product with respect to? What are our priority outcomes?
Okay. Maybe I could just ask a question that, coming from my background, I come from a Department of Food and Human Nutritional Sciences. And so the nutritional quality of crops is always something that crops and animal products is always something that is at the forefront in the research that I do. I'm wondering, there has been efforts to integrate nutrition into life cycle assessment and quality parameters. And maybe a question for you, Nathan, has that been something that you've been looking at in terms of the metrics around, for example, greenhouse gas emissions per gram of nutrient-dense food production? I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on that? And have you seen data sets being developed from that perspective?
Absolutely. There's a ton of really interesting work in my field generally around how to best incorporate nutrition into life cycle modeling and using what we call nutritionally normalized functional units. So when we are comparing among different outcomes, we're doing it on the basis of, well, what kind of nutrition is actually being provided. One of my PhD students, Nicole Bamber, is researching potential alternative allocations of agricultural land and agricultural products in Canada, comparing the outcomes on the basis of nutrition. So I believe she's combining kind of the traditional dietary indispensable amino acid score approach with some other modeling that looks at the benefits and disbenefits of specific nutrients within food products. So she can compare, the outcome of a product moving through supply chain A into whatever processed product versus it being consumed directly or funneled through livestock. And at the end of the day, say, well, these are the environmental and nutritional advantages and disadvantages of these different strategies.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we're getting to the end of our question and answer period. This went by very fast. I wish we could have another hour to explore these topics, but I'd like to ask both of you, if you want to give sort of your 30-second wrap up, what do you see as, if you could present, so what do you see as the key takeaway message that you'd like to leave with our audience today? Perhaps I'll start with you, Mario.
Well, a key is that nitrogen management will probably be the biggest factor in the development and evolution of our agroecosystems in Canada and in the world as we move towards 2050, 2080. And so we really do need a wholesale change in the construction, design of our food systems. And nitrogen is a key factor in how that evolution is going to come about. And we're on a pathway now to, I think I'm getting more than 30 seconds here. Legumes.
I do want to give Nathan a chance to speak.
Yeah. So legumes are going to be coming back into that mix of importance in that new evolution.
Thank you, Mario. Nathan, you've got about 15 seconds before we get turned out, about 10 seconds. So,
Sure. Well, I agree with Mario that nitrogen is fundamental. I guess my 5-second pitch is that sustainability is super complex and we have to keep our eye on all of the multiple sustainability criteria that matter to us to make good decisions in the end.
great. Thank you both very, very much. Appreciate the time and efforts that you put into these presentations.
Pleasure.
Thank you.